Shaz here, and today we're going to talk about 3 color stories that you need to know about to be able to make beautiful, colorful eyeshadow looks. If that sounds good, give this video a thumbs up and let's get to it. The reason we want to learn these color schemes and figure out how to identify them is because color schemes help us figure out what colors go with what colors look good with what colors, and what colors make what colors pop. And being able to visually see that is a key at making a beautiful color story. So let's get to it. The first color scheme we want to talk about, we are all familiar with, thanks to ColourPop. It's the monochromatic color scheme. A monochromatic color scheme is a color scheme that uses variations of the same color or the same shade. For example, we have all kinds of variations of blues. You might call this dark blue and this, I don't know, iridescent blue shade, but they all have blue in the name, so they are definitely blue. This is another one that is a pure monochrome. All of these are variation of lilac. Now we do have some shades that are a little bit more neutrally. They still have lilac in them, so these are all monochromes. If you bring a color geek, are they going to tell you this is a monochrome? Maybe not. Well, this would be more of a monochrome because this is undoubtedly blue versus this one. But in the eyeshadow community, we call all of them monochrome. This is another one that's not entirely monochrome, but we've been calling it monochrome. I mean, you do have 2 colors that are more or less gold, although this one does have a shift of pink, and this one is a variation of a red or burgundy. And this one kind of looks neutral, but you can call this a monochrome palette. We've been calling it a monochrome palette, although this comes with a disclaimer that ColourPop never claimed this is a monochrome palette. In the makeup community, we've been calling these monochromes, although they're technically not always monochrome. This is another one that is also not entirely a monochrome because these 2 colors, I would say that this one is arguably a very, very, very deep variation of yellow, maybe with a dab of green, and this one is kind of an olive, which is a variation of green. And this one, yeah, this is one of the ones that I think is absolutely monochrome. This one also is an absolute monochrome. If you're a complete beginner and you can't tell if a palette is monochrome, one other test is if you're making eye looks and most looks look the same, chances are the palette is a monochrome. If you have different variations of red, it's a little bit more difficult to make looks that look very different. When it comes to monochromatic colors, colors that have a composite nature or that are made of a combination of other colors are always more interesting to work with than colors that are just one shade. Now, you all remember from my other video about color theory, I'll tag it here. If you haven't watched that video, definitely watch that video, because if you all watch that video, you know by now that really the only colors that are just one color and are not a composite colors are our primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, which then automatically means that unless you have a red, blue, and yellow monochromatic palettes, all other palettes can be more interesting than the red, blue, and yellow palettes. And the reason for that is due to something that I mentioned also in that video, that when we're thinking about a shade that is a mix of other shades, there is this other element that adds complexity to the shade, which is the percentages of the colors that we combine to get that shade. So let's take purple, for example. If you're making a monochrome purple palette, in that palette you can have all the way from very cool toned leaning purple to very warm toned leaning purple. So you're not just having this just a purple mixed with maybe black or maybe with white, or maybe trying to figure out how to get more saturation out of the purple, but you actually can also play around with the percentage of colors that make up that shade to get more range and variation in your monotone palette. And we can see that in this palette, for example, from ColourPop. Now this is a monotone palette. These 2 are a a variation of purple, but they look dramatically different from all these other colors. And the reason for that is because these have more red mixed into them. So you can see how you can use that to your advantage when you're working with a monotone palette to make a more interesting, more varied monotone. This is kind of another example. This is variations of green. Some people might tell you this is yellow, but the truth is it does have some green in it. So these are both a variation of green and yellow, but there is more yellow in them than there is blue. Again, if you haven't watched my first video, I'm just going to reiterate that green is a combination of blue and yellow. So these two have more yellow than blue, while this one, which you might just call a teal, is completely a blue with a dab of yellow. Now, in the makeup community, we also call a lot of palettes that I personally call a duochrome a monochrome. For example, you all remember these palettes from BH Cosmetics, and we used to call these a monochrome. Now, while the blue one is a true monochrome, these are all just blue. Again, chances are if you have a red, yellow, or blue, the palette is going to look more monochromatic than if you have a palette that is a monochrome of a composite color, for the reason I just mentioned. But this one is supposed to be a red, and in here we see a lot of pinks. Now this is not a true monochromatic palette because a pink is not a red. A pink is actually a variation of purple, while this one we could arguably say is a different form of what I just mentioned. We have some purples that are more blue, that have more blue in them, and a lot of purples that have more red in them. These two colors, they're a variation of pink, but I just told you that pink is a variation of purple, so maybe we could pass them as a purple. Let's quickly mention how we can see a monochromatic color scheme on the color wheel. On a regular color wheel where you have just the same saturation of colors, it's very difficult to say, well, this is a variety of different reds that you can have. But a lot of color wheels go ahead and show the colors like this, where you see different saturations. And as you're moving from the center of the color wheel all the way to the rim of the color wheel, you're going to get the variety of shades. And as I mentioned, when it comes to composite shades, you could kind of take a very small wedge as long as that wedge still falls within that color range. For example, if you were talking about green, you want the wedge to cover any color that can be argued to be a green. You want to still remain within the secondary or the tertiary colors. You don't want to go into the primary colors. Now, the second color scheme that I want to talk about is a tiny bit more interesting than the first color scheme, and I've mentioned this also in my first video, which is an analogous color scheme. Now, analogous is just a fancy word for similar. And what this is talking about is a color scheme that is comprised of colors that are similar to each other. How we describe an analogous color story is by taking a wedge of the color wheel and all the colors that fall in that wedge. Or, as the name suggests, all similar colors. Again, remember, when we're talking about the color wheel, each color outside of our primary colors, red, orange, and blue, are mixtures of colors around it. So if you take any wedge on the color wheel, you are going to get a bunch of colors that have very similar properties and are comprised of the colors that are around them. And an analogous color story is also something we see very commonly in eyeshadow palettes. In fact, the duotone that I was just talking about is an analogous color scheme, or is an example of an analogous color scheme. We also have a few more examples of this here. You have varieties of burgundies going all the way to a variation of pink. You even have cool toned pinks down here. This one is another example. Now, you can look at this maybe as a monotone, but you do have a good bit of colors that maybe somebody could argue are not really green. Maybe somebody could argue this gold isn't green, although it does have, or this gold, although they both have some green in them. Or that some of these lower colors look a little more teal, so they definitely have more blue in them. Now, I would call this a monotone, but I could see someone argue to say that this is actually an analogous color scheme. This one is definitely not a monotone. Here we see purples and blues, so this is definitely an analogous palette. You also see purples that have more blue and then purples that have more red, and you are seeing a few pure neutral colors in here, which is completely out of balance for a monotone. So black is not even represented on the color wheel because it's considered to be a mix of all colors, and you have a silver, which is frankly a shimmer version of a gray. And seeing neutral colors is also something that is commonly seen in palettes that go beyond monochrome. The reason for that is, we mentioned this also in the first video tagged, that neutral colors in theory are comprised of primary colors. And remember again, you should be able to create the whole color wheel using the primary colors theoretically. So essentially a neutral color has the properties of any color in the color wheel, which is why neutral colors go pretty much with any color. Now, we're not talking about the warm toneness or the cool toneness. That adds a whole other layer of complexity. So there's a little bit of theory in what I'm saying. There is a lot more complexity to everything that I'm talking about, but that is the gist of it. And while we're on the topic of analogous color stories, let's also look at this one. Again, you have a lot of colors that fall on a wedge of the color wheel and some neutral colors just to balance it out. Another reason why brands add neutral colors to their palettes is because not everybody likes to or knows how to mix and match different colors, and knowing that neutral colors are pretty safe, they almost go with any color, is just an easier option. You can always pick a neutral color for your outer V area and put a color across the lid, and chances are, regardless of what color you're using, the look is going to be decent. Here's another example of an analogous color story. This is from BH Cosmetics, the Puerto Rico palette. There are a lot more. I am going to very quickly just show you some of the analogous color stories that I have found in my collection. Now, another reason brands love using analogous color stories, particularly when you're talking about colors and colorful palettes, is that because these colors fall on a wedge on the color wheel, working with them is easier. Chance of muddiness is minimized. Again, remember I mentioned this in my other video, that the reason eyeshadow is muddy is when you have either exact complementary colors mixed with each other or a variation of complementary colors mixed with each other. But when you use an analogous color story, you're probably not even getting close to using complements. It's fair to say that when you're talking about analogous color story, you can talk about a smaller wedge or a larger wedge, but chances are you're not even coming close to using any complementary colors. So it's just easier to work with a palette of analogous color stories by mixing and matching colors, because colors are never going to get an effect that is very unusual, like muddying into a brown or giving you something that is maybe not very desired. And because of that, if you don't know a lot about color theory, analogous colors are a safe way to use colors together and get more comfortable with colors. Because once you start working with complementary colors in a palette, you might at times get them blending into a color that you do not want. And you're probably not going to get that with analogous color stories. Now, on the flip side of this, because the colors that are in an analogous color story are very similar to each other because they have more or less the same nature, the closer and the more similar those colors are to each other, the more you're going to lean towards having a monotone palette, which makes the palette less and less interesting. And the reason for that is because you can't get a variety of eye looks out of the palette. I think a better analogy for really understanding this is using a crayon example. If you're trying to paint using a crayon set that only has variations of reds, oranges, and yellow, how many different paintings can you create? Not that many. Or you have to get super creative and probably paint a lot of things colors that they really aren't. Eyelooks is kind of the same thing. The smaller the wedge you're using on the color wheel to create that analogous color story, the more boring the palette is going to become. And very soon you're going to realize you can't get as creative with it because most looks are going to look the same, because there aren't that many colors available to you for making a look, which is where our next color story, which is a complementary color story, comes into play. Now, one thing that I did was looking through all of my eyeshadow palettes, and you all know I have a lot. You remember my declutter video? Trying to find palettes that use purely a complementary color story, and I failed. I actually could not find any palette in my collection that is only a complement, meaning they use, for example, greens with reds, or blues with oranges, or purples with yellows. If you have a palette that just does that, write the name in the comments below. But what I identified was, more often than not, if the palette is not in any of the categories I talked about already, it's gonna have a combination of complementary as well as analogous and monotone. For example, so we know reds, and although this is not a pure red, but it kind of is, red is a complement of green, and you can kind of arguably say you have used half of the color wheel to make this color story, and it's a beautiful color story, but definitely you have all of these intermediary shades, not just yellow and orange, but even some pinks that go to the other direction of the color wheel towards the blues. So you're using even more than half of the color wheel to develop this palette. This one from Rude was an interesting one, and arguably the one that I found having very interesting complementary colors. So all of these purples that you see are complements to the yellow, and this color is actually a deep yellow, and that one also as well. And this one is just a shimmer version of that. So these are all complements to each other, but then they came in and threw a few neutrals to pizzazz things up, and then having some teals. So then teals would go with the purples because they kind of create analogous colors. You have this purple, which is a variation of the purple. Yeah, so this is a very interesting color story and has some interesting complements in it. If you're wondering why you use complements, go back to my first video on color theory. I talk about that at length. This is another one also from Rude that has some interesting complements. So you have the blues and sort of the cyans, and you have the orange, but then you do have a lot of purples that you can use with these cyans or teals to also create an analogous story. But then you have the reds and the green, and arguably you can call this also a green, that you can use also to create complementary stories. Looking at this one, you have some reds. This is a deeper red that has a little bit of blue in it. So you could consider it as a burgundy, or you could consider it as kind of a purple. But then you have these very light greens, so you can use them to create sort of a complementary look. This quad at the very end by itself is an analogous color story. You can even take it further and use that as an analogous color story. I don't think you can see it in the video, but this has a hue of blue. It has a shift of blue. I don't think you can see that. It's one of those beautiful multichromes. So it definitely goes. I think the video is only showing its purple shift, but you can not only use it with the color right below it, but you can use it as a six span with all of these other colors. Also, a more saturated version of this green and maybe having a little bit more yellow would have been a complement to purple. So this is sort of an adjacent complement. I'm simplifying all of these. There's a whole variety of complementary color schemes out there. You have split complements, you have side complements. There's all kinds of complementary color schemes by itself. But we're simplifying it for the purpose of this video. Maybe in the future I talk about a more advanced color scheme. And this is another very interesting color story that is a combination of monotones, analogous, and complementary colors. You have monotone greens, and I love when brands try to combine multichromes or duochromes to add a flair to the monotone color story. So here we have an orange, sort of an orange that has a shift of blue, a shift of green. So it literally represents all of these matte colors in some way. And you also have a green that goes into a blue. So it goes both with the blue if we want to do the monotone look, or with the green. This is also a deep green if we also want to do the monotone look. But then you can think about the greens and the blues as well as this teal to come up with an analogous color story if you want to make a look using those. But you also have the orange. This one in the pan is not as orange. I think in the video it might look more orange. It's a little bit more of an olive shade. So a green that has a flare of neutral, and it would go really well with that one or with the other colors. And then you have this one, which is sort of a gold going into a green, going into an orange. So definitely a beautiful combination of monotones and analogous as well as complementary colors. I can go on and on analyzing every single palette that I have from the monochrome perspective, analogous perspective, and complementary perspective, but I want you to take that as a homework and start doing that when you're looking at palettes. Knowing these is essential at being able to create a beautiful color story, because being able to see what color goes with what color is going to look better with what color is going to pop with what color, just visually being able to recognize that is the key in making beautiful color stories. Okay, beauties, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did and you want me to make more videos like this, go ahead and give this video a thumbs up and let me know in the comments below. I also have a challenge for you. Take the Subculture palette and tell me the color schemes you find in this palette. I love you all. Have an amazing day, and until next time, bye.